exporting cheap products, but dump the waste in our backyards, contaminating all this water, soil, rivers, aquifer, and coastal seas. So at this point, this type of globalized sourcing is not sustainable. But working together, we are making efforts on that. But we hope that you, on the consumption side, could also join these efforts. Together, I think we could eventually overcome this massive pollution problem and create a better future. Thank you.
Thanks again, Professor Ma, for those words. I'm really looking forward to some interesting discussion on this in the group discussion later. Now we'll head straight into the third speaker in this session. Sam Giel is the deputy editor of an online environmental policy resource called the Zhongguo Huipa. So, welcome, Sam.
Hi, thank you very much for inviting me. It's been a really fascinating event so far this morning. I'm going to try and sort of follow on from where we've got to in this discussion. Actually, it feels like quite a logical progression. We covered something about the kind of financial frameworks earlier on. Talked a little bit about the scale of the problem and the lack of enforcement of regulation. And then Marjun has really introduced us to kind of, again, to the scale of the problem, but also some of the progress on environmental transparency and how that can be used, can be kind of leveraged by civil society, by media, by concerned citizens to try and make some sort of change. And I'm interested in this, and I've been sort of engaged in how that opening, transparency, and how sort of media activism and media attention can hope to bring a shared perspective to environmental issues and to climate change in particular. And I think I'm going to focus on climate change a little more also because I don't think we went into that so much in the discussion so far. So one way to frame it and to look at this discussion is just to look at my own experience with China Dialogue and how that's sort of developed over the few years. And I thought it might be interesting as well. We're at the Australia-China Youth Dialogue to just look at how one kind of experience of dialogue between sort of counterparts has worked out. So we started in 2006. We like to call ourselves the world's first fully bilingual website devoted to climate change and the environment. We're published in English and Chinese. We're based in London, Beijing, and San Francisco. And the idea is to use volunteer translation as well as professional translation to get a fully translated conversation about a sort of environment, so that you can really have a kind of very constructive dialogue across the language barrier. And now we've got around 60% of our readership in China. It includes officials and policymakers, journalists, thinkers, business people. But it's also from reader surveys, we can see it's predominantly younger people as well. So it's younger people who are really actually quite professional and quite influential within this field. And one of the things that I think is interesting is to look at the way the discussion of climate change in particular has developed just over those few years and how radically it's changed actually. I found that in 2006, 2007, just raising the issue of climate change in China was a fairly radical thing to be doing, or just raising it was a useful thing to be doing. There was very little public discussion about it, and I think talking to environmental journalists, activists, to our columnists, often people expressed skepticism about why climate change should be raised, and understand, and I understand this point of view, why climate change should be raised as an issue when there is such pressing and such a scale of direct environmental problems in China. People would say, climate change is this strangely kind of nebulous concept. It's very long term. It's got all these kind of uncertainties. When there are such direct kind of pollution problems that ordinary people face, how can you expect to really kind of to really have a conversation about this and to really make me think along about it in China. And I think things have changed quite drastically actually on that front in the past few years. You know, just I drew out an example actually, which I noticed on Jeremy Goldkorn was speaking yesterday on his website, Downward. There was an interview with an environmental journalist, which started with the question, you know, does the West have a right to ask China to reduce its emissions? Now this is an interview with a Chinese environmental journalist. And that question really, I think, has been the kind of impasse in the discussion about climate change between China and the rest of the world for really a long time. That any discussion about climate change seems to be, on the one hand, the West trying to dictate to China the terms of its development. On the other hand, sort of Western countries using China's rapid development as an excuse for its inaction. And it felt like there really wasn't a kind of a shared perspective to go on. But this Chinese environmental journalist has asked the question and responds, this isn't a right or wrong issue. It's only about negotiation. Everyone is trying to grasp opportunities in this green way, is the way to put it, and to make a compromise at the same time. So there's, you know, in a short time been kind of a very strong growth of awareness that actually there's a win-win here, that there are very that there are real gains to be made from low carbon development. That actually, regardless of your perspective on the urgency of mitigation of greenhouse gas emissions, actually there are very obvious win-wins in terms of direct environmental kind of effects. So, you know, cleaning up China's pervasive air pollution problems, you know, improving energy efficiency, moving up the value chain. All of these things actually are part and parcel of the low carbon development and climate change mitigation policies. The other thing I wanted to say is that aside from the scale of the problem, I mean, the scale of any kind of solution to these problems, particularly climate change, is absolutely huge, and the kinds of commitments that involves from business, from ordinary people, from government are massive. And I think that's why, for me, climate change particularly can't really remain a kind of a very removed kind of techno-scientific process. It can't really remain just in boardrooms or in UN climate talks like the one going on in Tianjin, or even just among NGOs. It really has to be something that ordinary people are engaging with. And so my interest became in how journalists and ordinary people and journalists and how media coverage was discussing climate change in China. And I've been looking at it quite in some detail really over the last few years. And one of the things I've been trying to work out is where that change came and why people have actually really started to talk so much more proactively and why climate change really has become something more of a political and economic priority in China. Now, one of the significant turning points seems to have been the IPCC report in 2007. This was a big assessment report that came out that looked at the physical science basis for climate change. And this really found that there is a scientific consensus on the likelihood, on the extreme likelihood of there being disruptions to social and economic systems and energy, food, water systems as a result of climate change. And this was reported very widely in China. It was on the CCTV1 news bulletin. There's been quantitative studies that have shown the extent to which really climate change coverage picked up hugely after this event. But then there are other things too. There were extreme snow events the following winter. There was the Beijing Olympics. There's been record droughts in the north, as Martin mentioned, and in southwest China. Of course, there was the Copenhagen climate talks in 2009. There were the so-called climate gate controversies over leaked email data and so on, which were reported quite intensively in China. And I think also it's important, I think the banking crisis and the recession actually turned global attention towards the idea of a Green New Deal. And this happened kind of globally.